Hi, welcome to the next video on totalitarian justice, and this is going to be the last video. Come here, Rocky. Up here. Up. Up. And here's Rocky. Yay. Just wanted to say hi. Okay. Good boy. Okay, get down. Down, Rocky. Down. Good boy. Okay. So let's quickly get straight back into it. Returning now to the history of these movements. It seems that the protectionist theory of the state was first proffered by the sophist Lycophron, a pupil of Gorgias. It has already been mentioned that he was, like Alcibiades, I always say that wrong, Alcidaeus, also a pupil of Gorgias, one of the first to attack the theory of natural privilege. That he held the theory which Popper has called protectionism is recorded by Aristotle, who speaks about him in a manner which makes it very likely that he originated it. From the same source we learn that he formulated it with a clarity which has hardly been attained by any of his successors. Aristotle tells us that Lycophron considered the law of the state as a covenant by which men assure one another of justice, and that it is not the power to make citizens good or just. He tells us furthermore that Lycophron looked upon the state as an instrument for the protection of its citizens against acts of injustice, and for permitting them peaceful intercourse, especially exchange, demanding that the state should be a cooperative association for the prevention of crime. It is interesting that there is no indication in Aristotle's account that Lycophron expressed this theory in a historicist form, that is, as a theory concerning the historical origin of the state in a social contract. On the contrary, it emerges clearly from Aristotle's context that Lycophron's theory was solely concerned with the end of the state. For Aristotle argues that Lycophron has not seen that the essential end of the state is to make its citizens virtuous. This indicates that Lycophron interpreted this end rationally and from a technological point of view, adopting the demands of equalitarianism, individualism, and protectionism. In this form, Lycophron's theory is completely secure from the objections to which the traditional historicist theory of the social contract is exposed. It is often said, for instance, by Baker, that the contract theory has been met by modern thinkers point by point. That may be so, but a survey of Barker's points Barker's points will show that they certainly do not meet the theory of Lycophron, in whom Barker sees, and in this point Popper is inclined to agree with him, the probable founder of the earliest form of a theory which has later been called the contract theory. Barker's points can be set down as follows. A. There was, historically, never a contract. B. The state was, historically, never instituted. C. Laws are not conventional, but arise out of tradition, superior force, perhaps instinct, etc. They are customs before they become codes. And D. The strength of the laws do not lie in the sanctions, in the protective power of the state which enforces them, but in the individual's readiness to obey them, that is, in the individual's moral will. It will be seen at once that objections A, B, and C, which in themselves are admittedly fairly correct, although there have been some contracts, concern the theory only in its historicist form and are irrelevant to Lycophron's version. We therefore need not consider them at all. Objection D, however, deserves closer consideration. What can be meant by it? The theory attacked stresses the will, or better, the decision of the individual, more than any other theory. In fact, the word contract suggests an agreement by free will. It suggests, perhaps more than any other theory, that the strength of the laws lies in the individual's readiness to accept and to obey them. How then can D be an objection against the contract theory? The only explanation seems to be that Barker does not think the contract to spring from the moral will of the individual, but rather from a selfish will. And this interpretation is more likely as it is in keeping with Plato's criticism. But one need not be selfish in order to be a protectionist. Protection need not mean self-protection. Many people ensure their lives with the aim of protecting others and not themselves. And in the same way, they may demand state protection mainly for others and to a lesser degree or not at all for themselves. The fundamental idea of protectionism is protect the weak from being bullied by the strong. This demand has been raised not only by the weak, but often by the strong also. It is, to say the least of it, misleading to suggest that it is a selfish or an immoral demand. Lycophron's protectionism is, Popper thinks, free of all these objections. It is the most fitting expression of the humanitarian and equalitarian movement of the Periclean age, and yet we have been robbed of it. It has been handed down to later generations only in a distorted form, as the historicist theory of the origin of the state in a social contract, or as an essentialist theory claiming that the true nature of the state is that of a convention, and as a theory of selfishness based on the assumption of the fundamentally immoral nature of man. All this is due to the overwhelming influence of Plato's authority. There can be little doubt that Plato knew Lycophron's theory well, for he was, in all likelihood, Lycophron's younger contemporary. And indeed, this theory can be easily identified with one which is mentioned first in the Gorgias and later in the Republic. In neither place does Plato mention its author, a procedure often adopted by him when his opponent was alive. In the Gorgias, in the Gorgias, the theory is expounded by Callicles, an ethical nihilist like the Thrasymachus of the Republic. In the Republic, it is expounded by Glaucon. In neither case does the speaker identify himself with the theory he presents. The two passages are in many respects parallel. Both present the theory in a historicist form, that is, as a theory of the origin of justice. Both present it as if its logical premise was necessarily selfish and even nihilistic, that is, as if the protectionist view of the state was upheld only by those who would like to inflict injustice, but are too weak to do so, and who therefore demand that the strong should not do so either. A presentation which is certainly not fair, since the only necessary premise of the theory is the demand that crime or injustice should be suppressed. So far, the two passages in the Gorgias and in the Republic run parallel, a parallelism which has often been commented upon. But there is a tremendous difference between them which has, so far as Popper knows, been overlooked by commentators. It is this. In the Gorgias, the theory is presented by Callicles as one which he opposes. And since he also opposes Socrates, that is Callicles, the protectionist theory is, by implication, not attacked but rather defended by Plato. And indeed, a closer view shows that Socrates upholds several of its features against the nihilist Callicles. But in the Republic, the same theory is presented by Glaucon as an elaboration and development of the views of Thrasymachus, that is, of the nihilist who takes here the place of Callicles. In other words, the theory is presented as nihilist, and Socrates, the hero, who victoriously destroys this devilish doctrine of selfishness. Thus, the passages in which most commentators find a similarity between the tendencies of the Gorgias and the Republic reveal, in fact, a complete change of front. In spite of Callicles' hostile presentation, the tendency of the Gorgias is favourable to protectionism, but the Republic is violently against it. Here is an extract from Callicles' speech in the Gorgias. The laws are made by the great mass of the people, which consists mainly of weak men, and they make the laws in order to protect themselves and their interests. Thus they deter the stronger men, and all others who might get the better of them, from doing so. And they mean by the word injustice the attempt of a man to get the better of his neighbours, and being aware of their inferiority, they are, I should say, only too glad if they can obtain equality. If we look at this account and eliminate what is due to Callicles' open scorn and hostility, then we find all the elements of Lycophron's theory: equalitarianism, individualism, and protection against injustice. Even the reference to the strong and to the weak who are aware of their inferiority fits the protectionist view very well indeed, provided the element of caricature is allowed for. It is not at all unlikely that Lycophron's doctrine explicitly raised the demand that the state should protect the weak, a demand which, of course, is anything but ignoble. The hope that this demand will one day be fulfilled is expressed by the Christian teaching, the meek shall inherit the earth. Callicles himself does not like protectionism. He is in favour of the natural rights of the stronger. It is very significant that Socrates, in his argument against Callicles, comes to the rescue of protectionism, for he connects it with his own central theses, that it is better to suffer injustice than to inflict it. He says, for instance, "Are not the many of the opinion, as you were lately saying, that justice is equality? And also that it is more disgraceful to inflict injustice than to suffer it. And later, nature itself, and not only convention, affirms that to inflict injustice is more disgraceful than to suffer it, and that justice is equality." In spite of its individualistic and equalitarian and protectionist tendencies, the Gorgias also exhibits some leanings which are strongly anti-democratic. The explanation may be that Plato, when writing the Gorgias, had not yet developed his totalitarian theories, although his sympathies were already anti-democratic. He was still under Socrates' influence. How anybody can think that the Gorgias and the Republic can be both at the same time true accounts of Socrates' opinions, Popper fails to understand. Let us now turn to the Republic. Let us now turn to the Republic, where Glaucon presents protectionism as a logically more stringent but ethically unchanged version of Thrasymachus' nihilism. "My theme," says Glaucon, "is the origin of justice, and what sort of thing it really is. According to some, it is by nature an excellent thing to inflict injustice upon others, and a bad thing to suffer it. But they hold that the badness of suffering injustice much exceeds the desirability of inflicting it. For a time, then, men will inflict injustice on one another, and of course suffer it, and they will get a good taste of both. But ultimately, those who are not strong enough to repel it, or to enjoy inflicting it, decide that it is more profitable for them to join into a contract, mutually assuring one another that no one should inflict injustice or suffer it. This is the way in which laws were established, and this is the nature and origin of justice, according to that theory. As far as its rational content goes, this is clearly the same theory, and the way in which it's represented also resembles in detail Callicles' speech in the Gorgias. And yet, Plato has made a complete change of front. The protectionist theory is now no longer defended against the allegation that it is based on cynical egoism. On the contrary, Our humanitarian sentiments, our moral indignation, already aroused by Thrasymachus's nihilism, are utilized for turning us into enemies of protectionism. This theory, whose humanitarian character has been indicated in the Gorgias, is now made by Plato to appear as anti-humanitarian, and indeed as the outcome of the repulsive and most unconvincing doctrine that injustice is a very good thing for those who can get away with it. And he does not hesitate to rub this point in. In an extensive continuation of the passage quoted, Glaucon elaborates in much detail the allegedly necessary assumptions or premises of protectionism. Among these he mentions, for instance, the view that the inflicting of injustice is the best of all things, that justice is established only because many men are too weak to commit crimes, and that to the individual citizen a life of crime would be most profitable. And Socrates, that is Plato, vouches explicitly for the there's a misspelling there. Socrates, that is Plato, vouches explicitly for the authenticity of Glaucon's interpretation of the theory presented. By this method, Plato seems to have succeeded in persuading most of his readers, and at any rate all Platonists, that the protectionist theory he developed is identical with the ruthless and cynical selfishness of Thrasymachus, and what is more important, that all forms of individualism amount to the same, namely selfishness. But it was not only his admirers he persuaded. He even succeeded in persuading his opponents, and especially that the adherents of the contract theory. From Carneades to Hobbes, they not only adopted his fatal historicist presentation, but also Plato's assurances that the basis of their theory was an ethical nihilism. I'm sorry if I pronounced Carneades' name wrong. I probably did. Now it must be realized that the elaboration of its allegedly selfish basis is the whole of Plato's argument against protectionism. And considering the space taken up by this elaboration, we may safely assume that it was not his reticence which made him proffer no better argument, but the fact that he had none. Thus, protectionism had to be dismissed by an appeal to our moral sentiments as an affront against the idea of justice and against our feelings of decency. This is Plato's method of dealing with a theory which was not only a dangerous rival of his own doctrine, but also representative of the new humanitarian and individualistic creed, that is, the arch enemy of everything that was dear to Plato. The method is clever. Its astonishing success proves it. But Popper should not be fair if he did not frankly admit that Plato's method appears to him as dishonest. For the theory attacked does not need any assumption more immoral than that injustice is evil, that is, that it should be avoided and brought under control. And Plato knew quite well that the theory was not based on selfishness, for in the Gorgias he had presented it not as identical with the nihilistic theory from which it is derived in the Republic, but as opposed to it. Summing up, we can say that Plato's theory of justice, as presented in the Republic and later works, is a conscious attempt to get the better of the equalitarian, individualistic, and protectionist tendencies of his time, and to re-establish the claims of tribalism by developing a totalitarian moral theory. At the same time, he was strongly impressed by the new humanitarian morality, but instead of combating equalitarianism with arguments, he avoided even discussing it. And he successfully enlisted the humanitarian sentiments, whose strength he knew so well, in the cause of the totalitarian class rule of a naturally superior master race. These class prerogatives, he claimed, are necessary for upholding the stability of the state. They constitute, therefore, the essence of justice. Ultimately, this claim is based upon the argument that justice is useful to the might, health, and stability of the state, an argument which is only too similar to the modern totalitarian definition. Right is whatever is useful to the might of my nation, or my class, or my party. But this is not yet the whole story. By its emphasis on class prerogative, Plato's theory of justice puts the problem, who should rule, in the center of political theory. His reply to this question was that the wisest and the best should rule. Does not this excellent reply modify the character of his theory? And that concludes the end of chapter 6, I think, Totalitarian Justice. And in the next chapter, I'm looking forward to that, is the principle of leadership. So we'll be going through Plato's education system and how he designed it and what aim he was looking to get at when designing the academy. So I hope you enjoyed that one. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye.